Oh my gosh, another video! In one module, you have three. It's pretty exciting, I know. But I just wanted to give you guys kind of an overview of some of the major theories regarding disability and the ways that we use normalcy to delineate between the binaries of disable and normal. Um, and kind of to help us really question like the norms of gender, what's considered normal for men and women, what's considered normal for people of color, what's considered normal um, for heterosexual people and for people who don't identify as heterosexual. I really want you to be questioning this whenever we say something, what are we assuming to be normal? And I think that disability studies is a really excellent way into understanding how we construct and use normalcy. Um, so first off, what does it mean to be normal? Well, so if you think about, the concepts of heteronormativity, a lot of people consider, that the ways in which we construct a lot of different identities in this world, or at least in America and in Western society in general, are centered on whiteness as a default. Whiteness is the norm. The way white people behave is considered to be how you're supposed to behave. That's the normal. And Leonard Davis, in his chapter, Constructing Normalcy, which I've linked to below, he really kind of looks at the historical use of the term normal. He really traces it back to the rise of statistics and the push for eugenics in the 19th century. For those of you who aren't familiar with what eugenics is, it's essentially the concept that you can create an ideal race or group by limiting the breeding of those people. So this was a concept that was really heavily advocated by Hitler. And so everyone thinks, oh, we never did that. We actually really bought into the idea of eugenics. By the mid 20th century, it was really used by a lot of white physicians to argue that white people shouldn't be mixing with non-white people because it created impure races and it brought up all kinds of issues that white people aren't supposed to have, and apparently that means that people aren't supposed to have. And actually, this is still an argument that's really made a lot by white supremacists still today. They still believe in eugenics and still argue for it. It was also though used to try and weed out disability. And honestly, that's still kind of an argument a lot of people make, that you should do whatever you can to make sure that people don't have disabilities, which that's the problem that Leonard Davis has. He says that normalcy really disguises, or the concept of normalcy and something being normal really disguises the vast differences that are between people, right? People have very different levels of ability. All of us do. But the concept of normal, he says, creates a binary that suggests that there are normal people and there are people who aren't normal. And that's the only two groups there are, right? And that disability resides in the non-normal group. Which is a problem, right? Rosemary Garland Thompson, one of my favorite scholars. I also have an article of hers below, in which she really refers to those she refers to this term normates. I don't know if you've ever heard of the word normates, but it's interesting because what she's doing is she's referring to people who have not been marked by the stigma of disability. And so what she's doing there is kind of pointing out that normal isn't really a norm, right? That normal is just a concept that we have created to refer to those who haven't been socially marked by disability. She also argues that we've been looking at disability in terms of what we shouldn't be as people, right? And of course, a lot of her argument hinges on, the use of feminists to fight stereotypes of women. And she's kind of saying, I mean, what if some people just have those things? And maybe that's not always those, for instance, being emotional and stuff isn't necessarily a bad thing. Maybe that's not abnormal. And she, thinks that maybe we should be careful about perpetuating that idea of what is normal and what is abnormal. Now, Alison Kafer, she actually first made this argument that Rosemarie Garland Thompson is building off of. In her chapter that I have linked below from Feminist Queer Crip, which is an excellent read if you're at all interested in disability studies and feminist theory together. She basically says in this that disability as we know it has become a fear of the future. Now, this could be the immediate future or it could be the far off future, right? It's not just about the far off future. So, for an example, one example she gives is that, a person in a wheelchair, right? Let's say the fear that your child is going to be living in a wheelchair is that they won't be able to get into a building. Right, and that's the fear. That immediate future that they won't be able to do something like get into a building. But what she's arguing is that's not the actual issue. The actual issue isn't whether your child will be able to get into a building. The actual issue is whether there will be a ramp or a structure to help them get into that building. Because if not, clearly that building was constructed based on access that's considered normal, people who have normal access, which again suggests that there's normal and there's abnormal, and that most people have this basic set of accessibility, and anybody else who doesn't is just different and abnormal, and that we have to make concessions for them. When in reality, we could just think about how can we get the most people to get into this building, right? This all really hinges on the idea of separating normal from disability. And so she says that when you perpetuate narratives that depict this binary of disability versus normal, you're really determining who should and shouldn't exist in this world, and you're creating fear. For instance, the fear of Down syndrome in children, right? Oh, he'll face issues in this world. His future is going to be difficult. And the issue becomes the child rather than society's choice to leave him out of certain things. This fear is used to generate all kinds of crazy pseudoscience, such as that perpetuated by anti-vaxxers, that is actually very dangerous. And of course, it really doesn't account, again, for the variability of access in this world and ability in this world. Like, we all have varying levels of ability in different ways, and to develop that fear is to suggest that there is an ideal way to be. And now, disability studies has been used by women's gender and sexuality scholars to really examine the different experiences of people, particularly in things like healthcare, and to really examine the lack of knowledge about those differences. Because when we assume there is a normal setting, a default setting, and anything else is deviant, then we're not really accounting for that range of experience. And so we're not going to be able to treat everybody and diagnose everybody and help everybody the way that we should. Nakira and Nakiran below, I have a link to their article below. They really suggest that it's not only important to look at public discourses and professional discourses that surround differences in healthcare, but to look at the lived experiences of individuals. Because really, when we listen to people's experiences, we learn about the differences that matter between them, right? When we really account for the variety in which people experience things, when we listen to those experiences, we're not just having touchy-feely feel-good moments and keeping people from being offended. We're actually making healthcare better, because we're focusing on not just the way people are the same, but the ways that they're different. And differences can be good and they matter. So, for example, ADHD, attention deficit hyperactive disorder. I believe I got that right. It was recently found to present differently in women than in men. And of course, the effects later in life and adult life are different for them as well, particularly because the way we've been diagnosing and treating ADHD is based off of this idea that it's primarily a disease for boys and a disease for men. A disorder for men and boys, but it's not. And if we had considered those differences a long time ago, if we had asked women about those differences and considered them and listened to them, we probably would have found out this information a long time ago. Holthe and Langvik actually talk about this in their article below. And so that's just an example of one of the many things that if we look at difference, it can be helpful, rather than assuming there to be a norm and anything else to just be different and abnormal. So as you're reading through, I want you to pick at least one of these below and at least glance at it, get an idea for what we can do with disability studies and why normalcy matters, or at least the concept of it and how it's used matters. But as you're moving through the readings on the next pages, these are going to be a lot more choose your own adventure. But I really want you to think about differences, right? Why do differences matter in the reading that you've selected? Why does experience and listening to those experiences matter? And what is the default setting that is being assumed when we are addressing healthcare issues, right? What is the norm that's being assumed? Is it a gender norm? Is it an ability norm? Is it a sexuality norm, an income norm? What is the norm that's being assumed? And what is being considered deviant? And how can we be empowering ourselves by considering difference?